Good to be back. It's been nice to have a break, and I'm glad to be back with you today. We're going to start a new sermon series that's going to go from now till after Easter. We're going to be in the book of John, looking at the things that Jesus did for the next 12 weeks. We're going to start there today and move through that. Jesus lives, he dies, he's buried, he resurrected. He ascends to the right hand of the Father. His closest followers said, we need to write these stories down. We need to pass these on to future generations. And Matthew, one of the 12, writes down his stories. And Mark, he writes down the stories of Peter. And Luke, he traveled with the 12, and so he gathers their stories together in an orderly account. And about the same time, all of those stories start circulating. They become what we call the synoptic gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they are to see with one eye. They're see kind of everything from sort of the same perspective. John is also one of Jesus' 12 closest followers. He's not just one of the 12, he's also one of what we call the inner three. There's Peter and there's brothers James and John. And he's one of those who are the closest to Jesus at some very intimate moments. But even more than that, as we get into the latter chapters of the book of John, he's going to refer to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. He had a very close relationship with Jesus, and he wants to communicate his story. But the other side of that is he lives longer than the other disciples. He's going to live to the age of 90. And he's heard their stories, and he wants to write something that's from a little bit of a different perspective. He wants to share some stories from a different angle. Now, he has one clear purpose in all that he's going to write. Okay? He doesn't hide that at all. John chapter 20, verse 31. Verse 31. But these were written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. These stories were written that you might believe that Jesus is his word is Messiah. That's Hebrew. Christ is the Greek form of it. In English, it means the anointed one. That you would believe that he is God's chosen one. I'm going to write stories that are purposely there to convince you that he is God's chosen, anointed one who lived on the earth and who died for us. And that in my stories, you begin to believe in him. You'll place your faith and your trust in him, and as you do that, you will find the life that God desires for you. He says, that's my purpose. And so we're going to go through some of those stories that are moving us towards that purpose. And as we go through these stories, we're not going to cover them all. There's 21 chapters. We're only going to hit 12. And in fact, we're going to skip the first chapter. All right? The first chapter is a setup. Let me give you the context. In the first chapter, verses 1 through 18, we have what we call the prologue. John writes this introduction to his book, and actually what it is it's an alignment back to Genesis chapter 1. That God created the earth, and in Jesus, he's going to recreate the world. He's going to set things right. And we have this comparison back and forth. And then we start into John the Baptist, John the Immerser. John the Immerser, he's got to make clear that I'm not the anointed one. I'm not the one that God was sent down as his chosen one. In fact, he points and he says, but that's him. And Jesus walks onto the scene. And in John chapter 1, he selects some of his first followers. He's going to have Andrew and his brother Simon Peter. He's going to have Philip and his brother Nathaniel. And they're going to come behind him and begin to walk along with their teacher. Chapter 2 starts us into the first miracle of Jesus. Jesus is at a wedding banquet, and they run out of wine. And his mother comes to him and says, Jesus, do something about it. I find that all fascinating. He's not performed a miracle to this point. I don't know why she thinks she'll do something. But Jesus performs his first miracle at a wedding in Canaan as he turns water into wine. Now, my last sermon series that I did before my vacation was asking for a friend. And some of you people sent me this meme. I'm not going to say who sent it, but sent me this meme. Okay, the meme said, can someone tell me on which page of the Bible it explains how to turn water into wine? Asking for a friend. Well, that's not the point. The point is not so you can have an endless supply of wine. All right? It's that Jesus begins his ministry at a wedding celebration. He eventually will return. And when he returns in the book of Revelation, he also finds himself at the culmination of the age at a wedding celebration. He begins with this place in which man and woman are united, and eventually he will return at a place where man and or God and humanity are united. And it's a place of celebration. It's a banquet. And then we have a story that comes in two parts. I'm going to focus on just the first part of it today. We call it the clearing or the cleansing of the temple in John chapter 2. I'm going to pick up in verse 13. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords, and he drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle, and he scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." It's the time of the Passover. And all over the known world, people who are of Hebrew background, who are followers of the Jewish religion, are going to come to Jerusalem to worship at the temple. And Jesus is going to clear it. Now, what's partially interesting about this story is that it's also recorded a story very similar in Matthew chapter 21, in Mark chapter 11, and Luke chapter 19. We have a very similar story of Jesus clearing the temple. That one, though, is placed at the end of his ministry. And some people have speculated, well, John took that story and he pulled it up and he put it at the beginning of Jesus' ministry because he has a theological point he wants to make. And so he's telling it out of story, and that's okay. But if you look at both the stories, they are different. Jesus does different things. Jesus says different things. The response of the people is different. And I'm 100% convinced that Jesus starts his ministry by cleansing the temple, and then right before his crucifixion, he's going to do it again. He's trying to drive home some important lessons, and each one is a little bit unique. And I'm going to tell you, you may have heard this story before. You may have heard it preached on from Matthew, Mark, or Luke, but this is John's perspective, and I want you to hear that today. And I'm going to do sort of two parts of it. The first one I want you to understand is the corruption. The corruption. It's the time of the Passover. If you were a Jew from wherever you lived, hundreds of miles away, you would want to come to Jerusalem where the one and only temple was. There you could offer sacrifices, and there you could make your life right with God. And so every year you would travel with your family up to Jerusalem, sometimes hundreds of miles. People did it from all over. There was no real equivalent. In the Old Testament, it's when the people came out of Egypt and found freedom. And in the New Testament, maybe the most equivalent is our Easter. We kind of place Easter as the high religious day, and they place the Passover as their highest religious day. And so people have all come to Jerusalem. Now, as they did that, they had a couple of different choices. Okay, one was they could either bring their own sheep, so or cow, whatever you were going to sacrifice, or your own doves. You could bring them with you. Now, if you're traveling hundreds of miles, you might not want to do that. So your other option was just to, when you get up there, to purchase one. That way I don't have to worry about something happening to it. I don't have to feed it. I don't have to deal with it. We just get there and we can buy one. The other thing that was going on was that people would sometimes travel, and as they would travel, well, coyotes would attack, things would happen, and the sheep that they had brought, the animal they had brought, would somehow get blemished. And the lamb was to be without blemish or defect. It was to be a spotless animal. And the priest might look at that, the investigating priest, and he may say, this is not worthy of sacrifice. What do you do then? Well, you have to buy another one. And so as a result, the outer court of the temple was called the court of the Gentiles, has been set up with booths that are now selling things. It was called, according to John MacArthur, the Bazaar of Annas. Okay, the high priest's name was Annas, and he said, you know what, not only can we do is sell and make these people's life easier by giving them stuff, I could also make some money. And so he found this as an opportunity to pad his own pockets by setting up these different places where he was going to sell animals. I don't have a great comparison. The best comparison I could come up with was I've never been to the Missouri State Fair, but growing up as a child, my parents always took me to the Indiana State Fair. And at the Indiana State Fair, there was a big main street, and at the end of it, there was all these different rides. And then there was on this main street, on one side, there was the stadium, and they had like a country concert would be going on. Then there along Main Street would be vendors, and they're selling food. That's where I learned about things like elephant ears. I don't know if anybody has ever eaten that, or funnel cakes, fried dough, all of it. Very good for you, I'm sure. And then you could go into the building next door, and they always had the state's biggest hog. All right, and that was always kind of an exciting part. We'd go watch the Oak Ridge Boys, then we'd eat fried dough, and then we would go across and look at that. And that's kind of the setting of what's going on here. People have come from all over, and they are enjoying. There are animals around that they can see, and there are people bidding and bartering back and forth, and there's the smell of animals, and it's a carnival atmosphere. And the high priest found, though, was if he could get a couple corrupt priests, this could really be a money-making deal. See, all he needed was every priest that was doing the investigating to find something wrong with almost every animal. Everyone comes up, here's my sheep for sacrifice, and as he looked it over, no, not good enough. And everybody was forced to buy something. And the high priest loved it. He wasn't making money for the temple. He was making money for himself. And two things played out. One, where people were forced to buy overpriced items. People were forced to buy overpriced items. What do you do if you've traveled hundreds of miles with your family, you get to the temple, and the priest tells you your animal is not worthy of sacrifice? You don't just go, oh, well, and head back home. You're in a situation where you have to do and you have to pay what they demand. Last Sunday, my son won tickets to the Chief games, and so I went with him up there. And, you get hungry while you're there. And I don't know if you bought food at Arrowhead Stadium, but let me just tell you this. I bought 2 things of nachos and 2 sodas, almost $50. All right? You know why? Because that's the only food you can have. And if you're hungry, you pay what they're asking. Well, that's the way with these animals. They were charging sometimes 6 to 8 times the value of an animal. Because we have you over a barrel. What else are you going to do? People were shelling over money for these animals. Second thing they were doing was they were being forced to pay an unreasonable tax. Okay? Here's how this worked. When you went to the temple, you also had to pay a tax. Now, the tax itself was good, okay? It was established years before as a way to maintain the temple. You had to give them a specific shekel. It's called a Tyranian shekel, and it was the purest of silver. You had to pay, every family had to pay one of those as their tax, and that money then was used to maintain the temple, which is all good. The problem was, again, they had you over a barrel. Money, if you've come from a distant land, you've got this wad of money that's come from your homeland, and you need to exchange it for the right shekel. Now, if you were to go to a bank in most settings, then it was charged somewhere, they said, between 2 and 4% to exchange money. At the temple, about 25%. So your $125 is only going to get you a $100 shekel. And it was a setting where there was corruption. There was no set fees. There were no set prices. And people were bartering back and forth, not knowing what others were doing. And it had become a place of corruption. Because people were selling these things, well, with a good cause. It's going to go to sacrifice. But in a way that maybe was ungodly. And I want to pause there because I think within this passage there is a little bit of something that we have to wrestle with as Christians and as a church and as church leaders. How do we approach buying and selling at church? So, see, I've seen both sides of this scenario. When I was planting the new church in Iowa, I went to visit other new churches, and I went into one church, and they met in this retirement community building, and as you came in the door, they had set up on the right side, there was a thing full of T-shirts with the church name on it, and there was a thing full of sweatshirts with the church name on it. Next to that, they had tables with all of the latest sermon series CDs, and next to that, there was tables with books on it, and their lobby was completely filled. They were selling all kinds of things. I asked the minister about it. He said, that passage that's not about us. That's about them. They were price gouging. We're just trying to get our name of our church out there. Okay. I'll give you a different example. My home church, I think kind of under the leadership of my father when he was chairman of the elders many, many years ago, they made a decision, passed through. It's been about 30, 40 years ago now. There is no selling on their church property. There is no money to exchange hands. They're so far as your child has a fundraiser for school, and we want to ask the people at church, you're going to guilt them into that, right? Because that's how it works. You can't sell. There's nothing that happens on the church ground. No money exchanges hands, period. But where do you fall as a church? It's a legitimate question. I think part of your answer has to come from the second half of this. See, while there's corruption, there's a cleansing. Jesus stands there and he sees everything going on. He sees the money exchanging hands. He sees all that's happening. And he's filled with emotion. Now, I looked up a lot of sermons on this passage. Almost every sermon that I looked up had the exact same path that it went down. The sermon was about anger. And Jesus gets mad, but it's righteous indignation because he's mad about the way the people are treating the temple. Okay, I follow you. Here's the problem that I found. No passage ever says he was mad. No passage ever says that he was angry. I mean, is it possible that he was heartbroken? Is it possible there are tears streaming down his face during this story? So I understand we need to handle anger properly, but I don't think this is the story to go do that. Now, I get why they say it. Because the first thing that Jesus does, Jesus, it says, makes a whip. Okay, let's pause there for a second. How do you picture Jesus? All right, how do you picture Jesus? I picture Jesus, long hair, meek and mild, kind of a hippie style to him. He talks about love and peace and grace and goodness all the time. He stops here and he makes a whip. We have to be careful about the way that we paint Jesus. Mark Galli has a book that I've always loved. It's called Jesus, Mean and Wild. And it's a story, accounting of 17 different stories in the Gospel of Mark in which Jesus doesn't fit into our little mold of nice, hippie Jesus. Here, it says he fashioned, he didn't just pick up a whip, he made one, which means he picked up probably a piece of rope, unwound the rope, then took little strands of that rope and tied into it a piece of rock or a piece of bone or a piece of glass. He fashioned a whip. Now, be clear in the story, he uses the whip on the animals, not the people. Okay, so don't get that kind of. He's not cruel and mean, Jesus, right? But he's forceful. He's forceful, Jesus, and he's going to use it on the animals, which makes sense. I mean, the animals are around people. There's a lot of noise and chaos. You're not just going to go up and go, "Come along, boy, get out of here." You're going to put some force behind it. Get out of here and drive the animals out. And then he proceeds to clear everything else out of the temple. He drives the animals, which will force the people who are selling them to chase after them out of the courts. He yells at the people with the doves, "Stop selling doves," which I find interesting. He didn't open their cages and throw them free. He respected the owner. Get them out of here. And then he goes to the money changers. And he grabs the tables and he overturns the tables, which I'm sure sent the money changers scrambling to pick up the coins in the dirt. And I imagine the children that were gathered around also diving and scrambling to pick up those coins. It's a chaotic scene. I kind of wonder, why did it happen? I mean, who lets Jesus do this? Maybe it's because it's a divine moment. Okay, it's when Jesus is doing something divine, nothing is going to stop him. No one's going to hinder him. Maybe it's because the people who were there were all kind of hirelings. It wasn't their money at stake. It was the high priest. And so, you know what? I see a guy coming with a whip. It's all right to just sort of back away and let him have his time. The Romans wouldn't have cared. The Jews fighting with Jews, they could care less. And Jesus there drives them out. Now, we have to be careful about how we understand this. There's a guy named Martin Newell, who's a Catholic priest in London. He crusades against nuclear weapons. He marches against them in the streets, has sit-ins, different things that he puts together. Last year, he spent 6 months in jail after one of his protests. After he got out, he was interviewed by the London newspaper, and he said, this is what we have to do. We have to stand against injustice. And he said, it's just like Jesus cleansing the temple. There's one problem with that. If there is two stories, he cleanses the temple here. In 2 years, it's back to doing the same thing. It didn't change anything. I would almost bet they were back the next day because there's money to be made. So what's the point? What is Jesus doing? If this is not a how you change the world kind of passage, what is it? Well, what Jesus says in verse 16 is important. And there amidst the chaos, stop making my Father's house a market. Now, he doesn't say anything about the corruption. He doesn't say stop overcharging people. He doesn't say stop selling. He's focused on the fact that people are not being allowed to worship because they've turned it into a place to sell things. People are not being allowed to worship. They're coming to the temple. This is the outer court. You have to go through here to get to the inner courts, and people are being distracted and pushed aside, and they are not allowed to come in and worship. The disciples, they have time to reflect on this. John, writing this years later, okay, he says this in verse 17. He said, his disciples remembered that it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. Zeal. He was zealous to the point for the temple, for God's house, for his presence, and for this time of worship, so much that the word literally means he was eaten up with it. It consumed him. It was all he was driven by. At that moment, he wanted everyone to know there has to be a place for worship. And it's a quote from Psalm 69, verse 9. Now that probably doesn't mean anything to you. It's a Psalm of David. When it was written in Hebrew, it was written in past tense. It was that David was the one whose zeal for God's house consumed him. But when they translated it into Greek, what's called the Septuagint, when they translated it into Greek, they made it future tense. And the reason they did that, they said, oh, it's not just about David. It's about the one who will sit on David's throne. That the one who is coming, who is, what was the word? Messiah, the Christ, the chosen one, he will be all about worship. And if Jesus is all about worship, then shouldn't we be as his followers? If Jesus didn't want people to be distracted from worship, how easily are you distracted? What's distracting you? What does it take to keep you from worship of the Lord? I'm talking about daily, weekly, annually. Do you set aside time to say, I'm going to focus and I'm going to bow my head before the God of heaven and I am going to give him all the glory and honor he deserves? Are you about worship? Worship consumed Jesus. And he was at the temple and he saw what was going on. He was, I don't know, was he angry? Was he heartbroken? That people weren't treating the things of God with real value. I don't know. I just want to know this. What does it take to distract you from worship? What gets in your way? And what are you doing to remove it? I shared this story several years ago. So some of you may have heard it, but it made such an impression on me. Oh, we started the new church. We launched in September. One of our founding families was a guy named Tim Steele, and his wife, Sonia. We were about 3 months in when he got the report that he had cancer that was growing on his spine. He did what everybody does. We went through the treatment. We prayed with him, and he went to the treatment. He went through all the different chemo for a month or so, and when they went back, they said, not only is it not shrinking, it's continuing to grow at a rapid rate. He lost his hair, and they decided just to give up treatment. The cancer grew. As it grew on his spine, he was having a hard time with some of the things he could do physically, but eventually it started to take over his mind. And every week, I'd get up to preach, and we met in a movie theater, and we had, the seats went up, and then along the back there was an aisle, kind of like here, and I could watch as Tim would walk back and forth. The pain was so bad he couldn't sit down for very long. He would walk back and forth and back and forth. Conversations with Tim were difficult. The brain was losing its capabilities of functioning. He'd only been given less than a month, and I caught Sonia at the back, and I said, Sonia, you don't have to feel like you got to bring him every week. I said, enjoy every minute that you get with him. I said, everyone knows he's committed to the Lord. Everyone knows he loves this church. Everyone understands if you're not here. And Sonia said, you don't understand. This is the only place he wants to be. Every week, the one thing he demands he does is that he's here for church. I'm just going to ask. The world is filled with distractions and noise. What is keeping you from worship? Jesus was a man of worship, and I think we should be too. Let's pray. Father God, help us to focus on you, to take a few minutes every day, take an hour every week, to take a day every year, just completely give it to you. Let us not be distracted. That there are so many distractions. Help us to focus on you, to bow before you, to give you the honor and glory you're due. I ask this in Jesus' name.